Imagine yourself in the heart of Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved fertile valleys through an otherwise harsh land. Cities rose from the mud, Uruk, Uar, Babylon, places that pulse with life, ritual, and devotion to the gods. The people who lived here believed their cities were watched over by divine beings, and every temple stood not just as a building of stone and brick, but as a living house of the gods themselves. Within those walls, the sacred and the profane often mingled in ways that to us today can feel distant, even puzzling. Among the many roles bound to these temples, few were as misunderstood and as demanding as those of the women sometimes called temple prostitutes. The phrase itself, shaped by a later interpretation, often carries more scandal than truth. In Mesopotamian society, these women were not merely figures of pleasure. They were entwined in the sacred rituals of fertility, kingship, and divine blessing. To them fell the heavy burden of embodying the link between human worshippers and the forces of creation. Yet behind the ritualistic grandeur and poetic hymns, their daily lives were far from enviable. Stripped of much personal freedom, bound to institutions that defined their worth, they were caught in the tension between sacred duty and social judgment. To step into their world, you must picture towering ziggurats rising against the sky, their stairways meant as bridges between earth and heaven. Within the temple complexes, incense smoke curled upward while priests recited hymns in Sumerian or Akkadian tongues. Processions moved with measured rhythm, and offerings of food, drink, and perfume were laid at the feet of carved gods. The women who served within this environment lived constantly under watchful eyes, not only of their fellow citizens, but the gods they were sworn to honor. It was a life wrapped in paradox. On one hand, temple women were connected to the highest rituals of the city, sometimes even linked to the king's symbolic union with the goddess Inanna or Ishtar. Their actions were said to ensure fertility of the land, the strength of the people, and the prosperity of the city. On the other hand, outside the sacred precincts, they could face stigma and whispers. Their role placed them apart, respected in ritual, yet judged in daily life. This tension made their existence difficult, and their fate precarious. What did it feel like to inhabit such a role? To live in chambers where your body was not wholly your own, where offerings of grain and oil could be plentiful, yet your freedom of movement was scarce? To carry a title that elevated you in hymns but diminished you in gossip? These women lived not only with the burden of ritual, but with the reality that once their time of service ended, reintegration into ordinary society was rare. In this journey, we will explore not only their daily struggles, but also the wider world of Mesopotamia that shaped them. We will look at how kings used sacred marriage rites to legitimize their power, how myths of Inanna and Dumuzi gave symbolic meaning to human intimacy, and how archaeologists today untangle the layers of truth from misinterpretation. And finally, we will contrast the lives of these temple women with those of Mesopotamian elites, the kings, queens, and high priests who experienced the sacred world from an entirely different vantage point. So settle in. Let the past wash over you with its strange mixture of reverence and hardship. Tonight, we will walk through the courtyards of the temple, past the silent statues of gods with wide, staring eyes, and into the chambers where women bore the heavy mantle of divine service. It is a story of devotion, power, and suffering woven into the oldest cities of human civilization. Imagine yourself stepping onto the dusty streets of an ancient Mesopotamian city. The sun presses down with relentless heat, glinting off clay bricks baked hard by centuries of use. The air is heavy with the scent of incense, barley beer fermenting in clay jars, and the faint tang of river water that sustains all life here. Looming above the city's low houses rises the massive bulk of the temple complex, its ziggurats stretching toward the sky like a stairway for the gods. This is not just a place of worship. It is the very heart of the city's identity, and it is here that the women known as temple prostitutes, or more accurately, sacred servants, live much of their lives. The word prostitute is a label that later generations imposed, carrying connotations not entirely faithful to what these women represented. In Mesopotamian society, They were entangled in rituals of fertility and divine presence. Their bodies were seen not only as flesh, but as symbols, living instruments through which gods and humans might touch. Yet, for the women themselves, the symbolic role translated into a demanding, constrained existence. The temple was a city within a city. Behind its thick walls lay courtyards filled with a bustle of priests, scribes, cooks, guards, and singers. Storerooms held grain, dates, and wool brought as offerings. Altars burned with oil, and statues of gods stared with wide, inlaid eyes, their silence pressing upon those who served before them. In this world, the sacred women were both elevated and enclosed. Their duties tied them to a cycle of rituals, chants, and symbolic unions that reinforced the power of the temple and the king. To understand why their lives were difficult, one must picture the expectations that surrounded them. From the moment a woman was dedicated to temple service, her personal freedom was surrendered. She might have been given by her family in exchange of prestige or pledged as part of a vow. Sometimes she was chosen, marked out by circumstance or by decree. Whatever the path, once bound to the temple, her days no longer belonged to herself. At dawn, the temple would stir with activity. Fires were kindled, water drawn, offerings prepared. The sacred women rose with the rhythm of the priests, their lives dictated by the cycle of worship. They sang hymns, carried offerings, and participated in rituals that were said to ensure fertility of fields and families. On festival days, their roles expanded, songs rising louder, processions winding through the city, and ceremonies that drew the eyes of thousands. Yet behind the grandeur was a constant demand to embody the will of the gods, no matter the toll it took on their bodies and spirits. One of the most misunderstood aspects of their role was the practice later described as sacred prostitution. Ancient texts, interpreted through modern lenses, often exaggerated or distorted what truly occurred. In reality, sexual rituals were occasional, tied to specific festivals or symbolic reenactments of divine myths. The most famous of these was the sacred marriage, where the king would unite with a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna or Ishtar. But around this central rite swirled layers of lesser-known practices, moments where women of the temple enacted the goddess's power in ways that blurred the line between devotion and exploitation. Imagine the weight of such a role, to be told that your body was not your own, but a vessel for divine purpose, to feel the reverence of worshippers one day, and the quiet scorn of gossip the next, to be elevated in hymns, but whispered about in the markets. Such contradictions shaped their daily lives, pressing them into a liminal space, neither fully honored nor fully free. The temple compound was both sanctuary and prison. Within its walls, food was abundant compared to the uncertainty outside. Grain, oil, and dates flowed steadily into storerooms. Sacred women did not starve, but neither could they walk the streets without restriction. The temple doors framed their world, confining them in an endless cycle of ritual. And outside, society's perception was ambivalent. On the one hand, hymns described them as the brides of the gods, figures whose presence ensured cosmic balance. On the other, common people might mutter that such women were tainted, living in ways that lay outside the expected roles of wives and mothers. Marriage for them was rare. Family life was not their destiny. They belonged to the temple, body and soul. What emerges is a picture paradox. They held an honored role, but it was honor defined by others. They served in ceremonies of fertility, yet often never bore children of their own. They were bound to the goddess of love, yet could not love freely. For all the incense, hymns, and poetry, their daily lives were full of confinement, ambiguity, and sacrifice. If you pause and listen in imagination, you might hear their voices singing in the dim halls of the temple. The chants rise and fall, words shaped in a language already ancient by our standards. Their voices blend together, echoing against stone, carrying prayers for rain, for harvest, for protection. And yet behind those voices are individuals, young women who may have dreamed of a different life, yet found themselves instead woven into the fabric of sacred ritual. This was the reality of being a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia, a life that looked grand in the myths, but felt heavy in the living, a life where one carried the mantle of the goddess, while often losing the freedom to be fully human. The day began before the city fully stirred. In the cool of early morning, while shadows still lingered at the base of the ziggurat, the temple servants prepared for rituals that had been performed for centuries. Among them were the sacred women, rising from narrow sleeping chambers, their hair bound, their garments simple yet marked with symbols of their role. They were not wives, nor mothers, nor free laborers. They belonged to the temple. Their identities were defined by ritual obligation. At sunrise, they moved into the courtyards, where priests lit fires on altars. The women's duties could range from preparing offerings of bread, beer, and dates to singing hymns in honor of the goddess. Their voices, trained and steady, joined the rhythm of drums and lyres. Song was not entertainment. It was devotion, a way to bridge the space between human and divine. To falter in song was to risk offending the goddess herself. When festivals came, their tasks expanded. They might take part in elaborate processions through the city, carrying sacred objects, trailing behind statues of gods born on litters. These moments gave them visibility. Also exposed them to the stares of crowds. Citizens would cheer the gods, bow before the priests, but their eyes lingered on the women who walked in silence, embodying mysteries that few could name aloud. Respect mingled with suspicion. Were these women blessed by the goddess, or were they something less pure, set apart in ways that ordinary people struggled to accept? The temple compound provided structure, but it was also a cage. Once a woman was pledged, she rarely left. Outside its walls, her presence could spark judgment. Whispers followed her. If she ventured into market, merchants might look away or speak too softly, as though contact with her bore a kind of danger. Neighbors speculated about what truly went on in the temple's inner chambers, about the rituals that outsiders were never allowed to see. The sacred women lived within this contradiction, at once central to the city's survival and marginalized in its social fabric. Their meals were steady, their shelter secure, but the cost was steep, the absence of choice. Unlike wives who might find companionship or mothers who held children, these women knew that their bodies were pledged elsewhere. To dream of marriage, to imagine a household of their own, was to dream of something forbidden. For some, their service stretched across years. For others, it was lifelong. And when their time in the temple ended, reintegration into ordinary life was nearly impossible. A woman who had once been dedicated to the goddess could not easily become a wife. Families hesitated to welcome her back, fearing dishonor or misfortune. Many remained within the temple precincts, aging into roles of caretakers or teachers for younger initiates. In this way, the temple became not just a workplace, but an entire life, stretching from youth to old age. The emotional toll of this life is difficult to measure, but glimpses appear in the literature of the time. Hymns praise the goddess Inanna as fierce and loving, generous and destructive. To serve her was to live constantly at the edge of contradiction. The women may have found pride in their proximity to divinity, but they also bore the burden of embodying a goddess who was unpredictable, often dangerous, and always demanding. Their service was not gentle, it was exacting. And then there was the element of ritual sexuality. While not constant, certain festivals involved symbolic unions, acts meant to mirror the marriage of gods. For the highest among them, such as the end priestess who represented Inanna, this could mean direct union with the king in a rite called the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. For others, the lines were less clear. Some scholars suggest that sexual activity within the temple may have been ritualized, occasional, and symbolic. Others argue that the women's bodies were available to wealthy patrons as acts of devotion. Whatever the truth, the sacred women carried the reputation, and often the stigma, of being tied to sex. Imagine what that meant in their daily lives. Every glance from strangers might carry insinuation. Every whisper in the marketplace could reduce years of service and ritual into a crude assumption. These women lived in the tension between myth and reality, portrayed as vessels of divine power, but judged as figures of flesh. Yet it would be wrong to see them only as victims. Many of these women were literate, trained in hymns and rituals. They knew prayers, incantations, and ceremonial forms that ordinary citizens never encountered. Some held positions of real authority within the temple hierarchy. In the Sumerian city of Ur, high priestesses were often daughters of kings, wielding spiritual influence that shaped politics. Even those of lesser rank could find pride in their role, their names recorded in temple archives, their duties woven into the rhythm of civic life. Still, the majority, the cost of service overshadowed its privileges. Their bodies were not their own. Their futures were predetermined. Their voices were raised in praise of gods, but rarely in their own defense. The stone walls of the temple, grand to an outsider, must have sometimes felt like barriers to another kind of life. A life of ordinary choices, of private love, of freedom to simply exist outside divine duty. Picture, if you can, the end of a long day. The rituals complete, the fires banked, the temple quiet. The sacred women return to their chambers, lit only by faint oil lamps. They remove their ceremonial garments, set aside jewelry worn for processions, and lie down on reed mats. The air is still, the silence heavy. Outside, the city continues. Families gathered around meals, laughter drifting from courtyards, children calling in the streets. But within the temple, there is only the echo of hymns and the weight of service. This was the daily burden of being a sacred woman in Mesopotamia. Structured, ritualized, and stripped of freedom. A life where the rhythms of devotion masked the quieter rhythms of longing, and where the title of bride of the gods came at the expense of one's own humanity. To understand the full hardship of life as a temple woman, one must look beyond the rituals and offerings and see how society regarded them. In a world where family lineage and household identity shaped every person's role, the sacred women stood apart. They did not marry. They did not bear children for their husbands' families. They were not part of the ordinary cycle of kinship, inheritance, and daily labor. Instead, they belonged to the temple, and this separation created an aura of both reverence and suspicion. Imagine the murmur of voices in the market. A woman carrying baskets of dates glances sideways at a temple servant passing by, whispering to her neighbor. Children stare, curious but unsure, for they have been told the temple women are set apart, closer to the gods yet somehow distant from human life. These small moments of isolation accumulated, marking the sacred women as perpetual outsiders in their own cities. The stigma was rooted in contradictions. On festival days, the same citizens who whisper about them might cheer as they appeared in processions, garlands in their hair, symbols of fertility in their hands. Songs praise them as the brides of the divine, their service believed to ensure prosperity for the land. Yet once the celebrations ended, they returned to their cloistered chambers, where silence replaced applause. The exaltation of ritual did not erase the quiet disapproval that lingered in daily life. For the women themselves, this produced a heavy psychological burden. To live under constant scrutiny, honored and judged in equal measure, must have created an enduring sense of tension. One part of their identity was celebrated, while another was condemned. They were neither fully revered nor fully accepted. The sacred marriage ritual, the hieros gamos, only heightened this paradox. To outsiders, it was a magnificent union of king and goddess, enacted through human participants. The high priestess, often of noble blood, embodied Inanna or Ishtar. Her union with the king symbolized a renewal of fertility and power. The city believed that through her, the goddess blessed the land. Yet beneath this grand symbolism was a human woman, whose role was predetermined, whose body was ritualized, and whose personal desires were set aside for civic need. For women of lesser rank, the weight was heavier still. Some scholars suggest that temple prostitutes, particularly those not of noble lineage, were sometimes available for ritual intercourse with worshippers. Whether or not this was widespread remains debated, but the perception alone attached stigma to their lives. A woman seen as serving the goddess of love might also be assumed to serve the lusts of men. Even if her actual role was restricted to singing hymns or attending altars, the shadow of suspicion followed her. This suspicion often bled into law and literature. Ancient Mesopotamian legal codes, such as those attributed to Hammurabi, drew sharp lines between women of different statuses: wives, concubines, slaves, and temple servants. Some laws protected sacred women, ensuring they were not treated as common prostitutes. Yet even this legal distinction reveals a tension. They needed protection precisely because society blurred the lines between sacred service and ordinary sex work. Their identity required constant defense. Consider the emotional strain this created. A young woman might be proud of her training in ritual songs, proud to stand in the temple courts, proud to wear garments marked with symbols of the goddess. But pride could never be complete, for she knew the whispers outside, the narrowed eyes of strangers, the impossibility of marrying once her service was done. Her devotion was demanded, but her reputation was always vulnerable. There was also the matter of isolation. Within the temple, women lived in close quarters, bound together by duty. They shared chambers, meals, and tasks, creating a small world that was both supportive and confining. Bonds of friendship surely formed, yet so did rivalries, jealousies, and quiet resentments. In such a closed environment, every action was noted, every word remembered. Privacy was scarce and solitude rare. For those who longed for a simple household life, a family courtyard, children's laughter, the temple walls could feel suffocating. Even the language of hymns carried contradictions. Inanna was praised as a goddess of love, fertility, and victory, yet she was also feared for her unpredictability. To serve her was to embody a being who could bless or destroy with equal force. The women who sang her praises lived in that shadow, aware that their goddess was not a gentle mother, but a figure of fierce power. To embody her was both an honor and a strain. And then, of course, there was time. The years of service stretched long. What began in youth could continue into middle age, leaving little space for personal choice. The sacred women grew older within the same walls, their roles shifting perhaps from ritual participants to caretakers of younger initiates. But always a separation remained. Outside, generations of families rose and fell. Inside, the rhythm of ritual repeated endlessly, indifferent to individual hopes or sorrows. This endurance required strength not often acknowledged in historical records, to live constantly with stigma, to bear the weight of paradox, to survive within the walls of a temple while the world outside judged and speculated. These were not small burdens. They were immense, and they pressed heavily upon every woman who bore the title of sacred servant. Picture, for a moment, one of these women standing at the edge of a festival crowd. The statue of the goddess passes by, carried high on shoulders, incense rising in fragrant smoke. The people cheer, their voices lifting in praise. And there she stands, both part of the ritual and apart from the people, knowing that she belongs in neither world completely. For all the grandeur of her role, she remains marked, both honored and diminished, both central and forgotten. This was the deeper reality of stigma. It was not a single act of scorn, but a lifelong pattern of being set apart, celebrated when useful, judged when not. A life lived in the space between reverence and rejection. The temple was eternal, but the women who served within its walls were not. Flesh aged, voices weakened, eyes dimmed. The sacred women who entered the temple as youths eventually found themselves older, no longer called upon for the most visible rituals, no longer adorned with garlands in public processions. Yet their service rarely ended with age. Many remained within the precincts, shifting into quieter roles, teaching chants to younger initiates, tending lamps, keeping watch over storerooms. In this way, their lives became cycles of repetition, echoing the permanence of the institution itself. The cost of this long service was most evident in what they never had. They did not know the rhythms of family life. No weddings of their own, no children growing at their knees, no grandchildren to carry their memory forward. Their names appeared in temple lists, scratched into clay tablets, but rarely in the genealogies of families. Their legacy was tied to the goddess, not to kin. When they died, they were buried as temple servants, their grave simple, their memory preserved only as part of the institution, some of higher status, particularly those from noble families, left behind inscriptions and hymns. The end priestesses of Uar, daughters of kings, were remembered for their roles in the sacred marriage and for their influence in civic life. But these were exceptions. Most temple women passed into silence, their individuality dissolved into the collective anonymity of sacred service. For them, the goddess's fame eclipsed their own. This anonymity itself was part of the human cost. To live a life where personal identity mattered less than ritual functioned meant surrendering the self to something larger. For the city, this surrender was a blessing. It kept the gods satisfied, the rituals unbroken, the cosmic order intact. For the women, it was a narrowing of existence, to be seen not as who they were, but as what they symbolized was a form of erasure. It is worth pausing here to imagine their quiet moments. Picture one of these women, older now, sitting in the cool shade of the temple courtyard at dusk. The day's rituals are complete, the fires burn low, and the city hums beyond the walls. She sits with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the faint sound of a lyre played by younger servants. Her thoughts may drift to what might have been a household of her own, a husband's voice, the sound of children, but she knows that those paths were never hers. The goddess claimed her long ago, and the goddess never releases what belongs to her. The human cost also extended into reputation beyond death. In later centuries, when outsiders, Greeks, Romans, and later interpreters, look back on Mesopotamian practices, they often misunderstood them. The phrase sacred prostitution was shaped more by outsider imagination than by lived reality. These later accounts exaggerated, simplifying a complex role into something scandalous. As a result, the memory of these women became distorted, remembered less as servants of ritual and more as symbols of exotic immorality. In this distortion, their sacrifices were erased yet again. And yet, despite the hardship, there was also resilience. These women endured because they had to. They learned to find meaning in ritual repetition, in the steady rhythm of hymns, in the certainty of duties that never changed. In a world filled with uncertainty, floods, droughts, wars, and shifting kings, the temple was stable, and within it, so were their lives. It was not freedom, but it was continuity. In this sense, they may have drawn strength from the very rituals that confined them, finding in repetition a strange kind of comfort. Still, the larger truth remains. It was not easy to be a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia. The role demanded sacrifice of body and spirit. It brought honor without acceptance, ritual without freedom, devotion without personal choice. Their lives were given over to sustaining the link between human and divine, but the price was steep, paid in isolation, stigma, and anonymity. For us today, their story is unsettling because it resists simple categories. They were not simply victims, nor were they entirely privileged. They occupied a liminal space, carrying roles too complex for modern labels. Their existence reminds us that ancient societies often demanded sacrifice from some for survival of all. In this case, it was women bound to temples, whose lives were given to preserve cosmic balance. The conclusion of Segment 1 then leaves us with a picture of paradox. It was both sacred and stigmatized, both honored and erased, both secure and imprisoning. To walk in their sandals was to walk a narrow path between reverence and rejection, ritual and reality. And as we leave their chambers behind, we carry with us the sense of weight they bore, the human cost of devotion. When next we turn to Segment 2, we will leave the collective lives of the temple women and turn our gaze to a single figure, a man whose rise reshaped the world of Mesopotamia, kings who claimed the gods' favor through sacred marriage. By tracing their stories, we will see how the fates of women and rulers were intertwined, each dependent on the other to sustain legitimacy and order in the ancient world. To leave behind the cloistered chambers of temple women is to step into the grander world of kingship, where power, ritual, and myth intertwined. In Mesopotamia, no ruler could claim legitimacy on military strength alone. Victory in battle and wealth from trade mattered, but the foundation authority rested on something deeper: the favor of the gods. To rule was not simply to govern. It was to embody the divine order, to stand as a chosen intermediary between heaven and earth. This conviction shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian kingship. The king was not himself a god, at least not in most editions, but he was more than a man. He was a shepherd of his people, the guardian of the city's covenant with its patron deity. Without divine sanction, his crown was a hollow ornament. With it, he could command armies, build ziggurats, and carve his name into clay tablets that would outlast generations. One of the most potent symbols of this divine connection was the ritual known as the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos. In this ceremony, the king united with a high priestess of Inanna, or Ishtar, the goddess of love and fertility. The act was not seen as mere intimacy between two people, but as a cosmic union between god and goddess, enacted through human vessels. By this ritual, the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the city, and the strength of the king were all renewed. The origins of this practice reach deep into Sumerian tradition. In the city of Uruk, hymns celebrated the goddess Inanna's love for her consort Dumuzi, a shepherd king. Their mythic union was believed to bring fertility to flocks and fields alike. When the king of Uruk enacted this marriage with Inanna's priestess, he was not just ensuring his own reign. He was reenacting the very story that sustained life itself. In ritual poetry, the priestess would sing as Inanna, praising her lover, the king. He, in turn, would respond as Dumuzi, pledging devotion. The city listened, believing that through these words, the cosmic cycle was renewed. For the priestess, often a royal daughter, this role was both powerful and demanding. She embodied the goddess in a way no one else could. Through her, the king's authority was sealed. Through her, the city's prosperity was secured. Yet behind the grandeur was the same paradox that marked the lives of lesser temple women. Her individuality was subsumed into her role. She was remembered not for herself, but as the vessel of the goddess. The kings, however, gained immeasurably. By enacting the sacred marriage, they declared themselves chosen. Their reign was not only permitted, but divinely ordained. This was essential in a world where power shifted easily, where rival cities competed, and where conquest could overturn dynasties. To claim the goddess's blessing was to rise above mere politics and into the realm of cosmic necessity. Archaeological discoveries hint at how central this ritual was. Hymns written on clay tablets describe the dialogue between priestess and king, often in vivid, sensual poetry. Bridegroom, dear to my heart. One begins, spoken in the voice of Inanna through the priestess. You have captivated me. Let me stand trembling before you. These words, sung in the temple, were more than private affection. They were public declarations of cosmic harmony. The audience was not just the courtiers gathered in the hall, but the gods themselves. For the people of the city, the sacred marriage was reassurance. It told them that the gods still favored their ruler, that the harvest would be plentiful, that enemies would falter, in a land where rivers could flood unpredictably and droughts could strike without warning. Such reassurance mattered deeply. Life was fragile. Ritual was stability. Yet this ritual also reveals the deep intertwining of women's roles and kingship. The authority of the ruler depended not only on his own strength, but on the service of women tied to the temple. Without the priestess, without the embodiment of Inanna, the ritual could not occur. In this way, the lives of temple women and the fate of kings were bound together. One carried the burden of divine service. The other reaped the fruits of legitimacy. It is important to see kingship not as a single figure at the top, but as a network of ritual, belief, and performance. The sacred marriage was only one ceremony among many, but it was among the most symbolic. Through it, the king became not just a man in power, but the cosmic spouse of the goddess herself. In a world where myth and reality merged seamlessly, This was not theater, it was truth. Still, not all kings performed the ritual equally. Some emphasized it heavily, weaving it into their propaganda. Others leaned more on military conquest or monumental building projects. But even when the sacred marriage was not enacted in visible form, its symbolism lingered. The image of Inanna embracing her chosen shepherd king was etched into the cultural memory of Mesopotamia, shaping expectations of what a ruler should be. As centuries passed, the practice shifted. In some cities, the ritual became more symbolic, with songs and hymns standing in for actual physical union. In others, the tradition faded altogether, replaced by new forms of legitimization. But the echo remained. Kingship required divine sanction, and the goddess of love and fertility was one of the most powerful givers of that sanction. When we step back, we see a pattern. The lives of women in the temple, confined and stigmatized, were also the foundation of political power. Their rituals, their songs, their bodies even became instruments by which kings ruled. The paradox was complete. Women who lived constrained lives enabled men to claim freedom and authority. Thus, to understand Mesopotamian kingship, one must understand the sacred women. Their devotion, their endurance, and their service were woven into the very fabric of royal legitimacy. Behind every king who claimed the goddess's blessing stood a woman who embodied her, often at the cost of her own life's possibilities. And so, as we continue deeper into segment 2, we will explore not only kingship itself, but the individuals who shaped it. The great rulers who tied their reins to the gods, and the priestesses whose names echo faintly through clay tablets and hymns. Together, they reveal the intricate dance of power, faith, and sacrifice that defined Mesopotamia's earliest empires. If there was ever a king who embodied a union of human ambition and divine favor in Mesopotamia, it was Sargon of Akkad. His name still echoes across millennia as the man who forged the world's first true empire, uniting the city-states of Sumer and stretching his rule across the Fertile Crescent. Yet behind the stories of conquest lies another truth. Sargon's legitimacy, like all Mesopotamian kings, rested not merely on his armies, but on his claim to divine sanction. The legends of his birth already revealed this dynamic. Later texts describe him as the son of a humble priestess, set adrift in a reed basket upon the river, rescued by a gardener. He grew into a man of ambition, eventually serving in the court of Kish. From obscurity, he rose to kingship, a tale that mirrored the myths of divine selection. His humble beginnings, coupled with his sudden rise, made him appear chosen, favored by powers greater than chance. But Sargon's success was not only political or military. He carefully aligned himself with the gods, particularly the goddess Ishtar, whose temples gave him both religious and social legitimacy. By dedicating his victories to her, by weaving her name into his titles, he placed himself under her protection and favor. To his people, his victories were not merely the achievement of man, but the blessings of a goddess acting through him. The sacred marriage ritual was central to this claim. While direct evidence of Sargon's participation is scarce, the structure of his reign suggests that he embraced the practice. His daughters played vital roles in temple service, binding his dynasty to the divine. Most famous among them was Enheduanna, appointed as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in Uar. Through her, Sargon connected his rule to the most ancient cults of the land, embedding his family into the fabric of Sumerian religious life. Enheduanna herself became a figure of immense importance. She composed hymns that praised the gods, especially Inanna, and in doing so, reinforced her father's legitimacy. These hymns survive as some of the earliest known literature written by a named individual. In them, she describes the goddess's power in vivid, trembling words, songs that place her family in the orbit of divine favor. Through Enheduanna's voice, Sargon's dynasty spoke with the authority of the gods themselves. This intertwining of family, temple, and kingship reveals how deeply dependent rulers were on sacred service. Sargon's empire stretched by military conquest, yes, but it was held together by ritual, poetry, and the sense that he ruled with divine approval. His empire, unprecedented in scale, could have collapsed into rebellion, without such legitimacy. But with Ishtar's favor proclaimed in hymns and enacted in ritual, his rule carried weight beyond the battlefield. Sargon's titles reflect this balance. He called himself King of Kish, King of the Four Quarters, and Governor of Ishtar. Each carried layers of meaning. King of Kish connected him to the ancient line of rulers who had long claimed divine support. King of the Four Quarters expanded his rule to the world itself, a cosmic claim of universality. And Governor of Ishtar bound him directly to the goddess, presenting himself not only as a king, but as her chosen administrator on earth. In this, we see the same paradox that defined the temple women. Just as their bodies and voices were vessels of divine presence, so too was the king's crown. His power, though vast, was never wholly his own. It was borrowed, mediated through the goddess. Without her sanction, he was a man with armies. With it, he was ruler of the known world. Sargon's empire lasted for decades, and his successors continued his model. They too placed daughters in temples. They too proclaimed victories in the name of Ishtar. They too wove divine sanction into their reigns. But it was Sargon's brilliance in merging military ambition with religious legitimacy that set the standard. Yet even Sargon's empire was not eternal. After his death, rebellion simmered, and the unity he forged began to fracture. The gods that once seemed to favor him appeared distant, and enemies seized their chance. This decline underscores a crucial truth. Divine sanction was not permanent. It had to be renewed, reenacted, reaffirmed. Rituals like the sacred marriage mattered because without them, kings risked losing not only their people's faith, but also their own sense of legitimacy. For the sacred women in the temples, this meant that their lives remained bound to the shifting fortunes of kings. When a ruler prospered, their rituals gained glory. When a ruler faltered, their service might be questioned. Their god is seen as having withdrawn her favor. In this way, the burdens of kingship fell upon them as well, their bodies and voices implicated in the rise and fall of empires. If we pause and imagine, we might picture a festival in Akkad. The people gather in crowded squares, musicians play, incense drifts upward. At the heart of the celebration, Sargon proclaims his rule as sanctioned by Ishtar, and beside him, in the temple precinct, a priestess stands, embodying the goddess. The people cheer the king, but it is through the woman's role that his power is sealed. Without her, the proclamation would be hollow. With her, it becomes cosmic truth. Thus, the story of Sargon is not only about conquest and empire, it is also about the invisible labor of women whose service sustained his reign. His victories may have been carved into stone, but their voices, raised in hymns, carried his legitimacy into the heavens. If Sargon of Akkad embodied the rise of political power, his daughter in Hejuana embodied the spiritual authority that made such power enduring. Through her we see clearly how the roles of women in temples shaped not only daily rituals but the destiny of kings. She stands as one of the most remarkable figures in Mesopotamian history, remembered as the first known author whose name survives to us. And her story reveals how words, songs, and devotion could be as powerful as armies. Hejuana was appointed by her father as high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Uar. This was no small honor. Uar was one of the most ancient and revered Sumerian cities, and its temple of Nana held immense prestige. By placing his daughter there, Sargon bound his new Akkadian dynasty to the deep-rooted traditions of Sumer, weaving foreign conquest into native religion. In her person, Akkadian rule gained legitimacy, for she was both royal blood and divine servant. Her life was a fusion of roles. As a royal daughter, she carried the weight of her father's empire. As high priestess, she bore the mantle of sacred service. And as poet, she gave voice to the goddess herself. Her hymns, carved into clay tablets in cuneiform, have survived for over 4,000 years. In them, we hear not only praise for the gods, but also glimpses of her own struggles and triumphs. One of her most famous works, The Exaltation of Inanna, is both hymn and personal testimony. In it, Hejuana describes being cast out during rebellion, stripped of her role and left in despair. She writes of weeping before the goddess, of feeling abandoned, yet she also writes of the goddess's fierce power, her ability to restore, to conquer, to lift the faithful from ruin. By the end of the hymn, Inanna has answered her prayer, restoring her to her role and re-establishing divine favor. This is more than poetry. It is politics. Through her hymn, Enheduanna framed her personal restoration as a cosmic event. Her return was not merely the triumph of one woman, but the victory of the goddess herself. In this way, her words reinforce the legitimacy of her father's dynasty, showing that even rebellion could not overturn the divine order. Her voice was powerful because it merged human vulnerability with divine authority. She did not present herself as flawless or untouchable. Instead, she described her fear, her tears, her prayers. Yet through that vulnerability, she revealed the goddess's might. This fusion made her hymns deeply moving, blending personal emotion with cosmic truth. For the people of Mesopotamia, these hymns were not just literature. They were liturgy. They were sung in temples, recited in ceremonies, carried into the rhythm of daily worship. Through them, Enheduanna's voice echoed across generations, shaping how people understood the gods and their relationship to rulers. It is striking to think that the earliest named author in human history was a woman, a priestess, and a poet, in a world dominated by kings and warriors. Her words survived when the swords and crowns of her contemporaries turned to dust. Her hymns remain our window into the spiritual life of Mesopotamia, revealing not only theology, but also the lived experience of sacred service. Yet her life also reflects the same paradox faced by temple women across the land. She was honored, yes, but her honor was tied to her role. She was remembered, but primarily as the voice of the goddess, not as an individual. Even her personal hymn, with its vivid description of exile and restoration, is framed not as her own triumph, but as Inanna's. Her identity was both preserved and subsumed, marked and erased at once. Still, her resilience shines through. To write a despair so openly, to transform personal loss into cosmic poetry, required courage. Her hymns give us a rare glimpse of the emotional interior of the ancient world. Through her, we sense the tears, the prayers, the hopes of someone who lived 4,000 years ago, yet feels achingly human to us today. In Enheduanna, the intertwining of women's roles in kingship reaches its clearest form. Her father's empire depended not only on his armies, but on her words. Her hymns sanctified his reign. Her service in the temple wove his dynasty into the fabric of Sumerian tradition. Without her, Sargon's conquest might have crumbled more quickly. With her, they gained the aura of divine inevitability. If we pause and imagine, we might see her seated in the temple of Uar. Clay tablets rest before her, a stylus in her hand. The oil lamps flicker, casting soft light on the carved walls. Around her, the air smells of incense and warm clay. She leans forward, pressing symbols into the damp tablet, line by line, hymn by hymn. Her words are for the goddess, but also for the empire, for her father, for herself. Each mark she makes is both prayer and proclamation, both devotion and politics. Her story reminds us that history is not only the tale of kings and battles, it is also the story of voices, voices that sang, prayed, and wrote. Enheduanna's voice, rising from clay tablets, still reaches us today. She bridges a gulf of time, reminding us that the struggles of identity, legitimacy, and devotion are as old as civilization itself. When we step back from the stories of Sargon, Enheduanna, and the rituals of the sacred marriage, a pattern becomes clear. Mesopotamian kingship was never just about the man on the throne. It was about performance, ritual, and continuity. The king could conquer, he could build, he could command armies, but unless he could also show that the gods favored him, his reign was fragile. The union of political power with divine sanction was a foundation on which Mesopotamian civilization rested. The sacred marriage was one of the most visible forms of the sanction. Through it, rulers proclaimed themselves not simply as warlords, but as chosen partners of the divine. by enacting the love of Inanna and Dumuzi or Ishtar and her mortal consort. The king proclaimed that he was more than a man. He was a cosmic spouse who ensured fertility of the land. Without such rituals, his legitimacy would always be in question. Yet as powerful as a ritual was, it was never truly about the king alone. It always depended on women. A priestess, often a royal daughter, sometimes a dedicated servant of the temple, was the one who embodied the goddess. Without her, the ritual could not take place. Without her, the king's claim to legitimacy was hollow. The paradox is striking. Women whose daily lives were often restricted, stigmatized, and bound within temple walls held in their persons the very key to kingship. This model endured across centuries. In city after city, dynasty after dynasty, rulers bound themselves to the gods through ritual, temple patronage, and sacred unions. Even as political power shifted, Akkad rising, then falling, Sumerian cities flourishing and fading, Babylon rise in prominence, the underlying structure remained. Kingship was divine trust, and women in temples were its guarantors. Consider the later kings of Uar, who styled themselves as shepherds chosen by the gods. They too used rituals of sacred union to proclaim their legitimacy. Or Hammurabi of Babylon, whose famous law code begins not with legal articles, but with a prologue describing how the gods appointed him as just ruler. Every claim of authority was rooted in the same logic. Without divine approval, there was no king. Enheduanna's legacy also endured. Her hymns continue to be copied long after her death, recited by students learning to write, sung in temples across Mesopotamia. In this way, her words shaped not only her father's dynasty, but generations that followed. Through her, the model of kingship as divine marriage partner and servant of the gods was reinforced again and again. But for all its grandeur, the system had costs. The women who embodied goddesses bore the weight of symbolism without the rewards of power. Their service elevated kings, but confined them. Their names, except for rare figures like Enheduanna, were lost to time. They were the silent foundation on which the edifice of empire was built. Even the kings themselves were not immune to the fragility of this system. When famine struck, when enemies triumphed, when floods devastated fields, the people questioned whether the gods had withdrawn their favor. If so, the king's legitimacy could collapse overnight. Rituals of sacred union and hymns of praise could not always mask the realities of hardship. Thus, kingship in Mesopotamia was always precarious, balanced between triumph and ruin, glory and doubt. Still, the model proved enduring. It shaped not only Mesopotamia, but later civilizations as well. Echoes of sacred kingship can be traced in Egypt, where pharaohs were seen as divine, and in the Mediterranean, where rulers tied themselves to gods and goddesses. The idea that political power must rest on something greater than human will, on ritual, on myth, on divine approval, began here, in the temples of Sumer and Akkad. Imagine, then, a city festival in Uar. The people gather in the temple courtyard, incense rising, musicians playing. The king approaches, dressed in ceremonial robes, his crown gleaming. Beside him walks the high priestess, adorned as the goddess herself. Together, they enact the sacred marriage, their words echoing ancient hymns of love and devotion. The crowd watches, believing that in this union the fields will flourish, the flocks will multiply, the city will prosper. It is both theater and truth, both performance and faith. And in that moment, the king's reign is not just his own, it is the will of the gods, embodied through ritual. This was the legacy of Mesopotamian kingship. It was not simply governance. It was not only conquest. It was ritualized power, sanctified by women whose lives were bound to temples. Through their voices and bodies, through their hymns and unions, kings rose and fell. And through them, Mesopotamia created a model of rulership that would echo across the ancient world. As we leave segment 2, we carry forward the image of this paradoxical power. The kings who carved their names in stone relied on women whose names were forgotten. The empires that see maternal roles on the backs of rituals that demanded human sacrifice. not in blood, but in freedom. The goddess gave legitimacy, but she claimed lives in return. In segment 3, we will turn from rulers and priestesses to the mysteries of Mesopotamian culture itself. We will look at archaeology, myth, and ritual, the deep cultural currents that shape how these practices were understood. From the myths of Inanna's descent to the underworld to the artifacts uncovered in ancient temples, we will explore the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of Mesopotamian religion, unraveling what weakened the world that gave rise to sacred marriage, temple service, and the enduring question of what it meant to live in service of the gods. If kingship gave Mesopotamia its rulers, and temples gave it structure, then myth gave it meaning. Behind the rituals, behind the hymns, behind the heavy walls of the ziggurat, lay stories, cosmic tales that explained why the world was as it was. Chief among these were the myths of Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. To understand the lives of temple women and the legitimacy of kings, one must first understand her. Inanna was no gentle figure of quiet nurturing. She was radiant, fierce, and unpredictable. She embodied both passion and destruction, creation and chaos. In one hymn, she is described as a storm rushing over the land, terrifying armies and humbling kings. In another, she is a lover whose embrace brings fertility to the fields and joy to the people. Her power was dual, her nature contradictory. To serve her was to walk a narrow path between blessing and danger. The myths of Inanna reveal this tension vividly. Perhaps the most famous is the tale of her descent into the underworld. In this story, Inanna resolves to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the land of the dead. She dresses in her finest robes, adorns herself with jewels and symbols of power, and descends through the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, she is forced to remove one item, her crown, her staff, her necklace, until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister. There she is judged, struck down, and hung upon a hook like carrion. The world above falters in her absence. Crops wither, animals cease to breed, life itself halts. Eventually, the god Enki intervenes, sending help to restore her. Inanna returns, but not without cost. To leave the underworld, she must send another in her place. Finding her husband Dumuzi enjoy himself rather than mourning her, she condemns him to the underworld for part of each year. Thus the cycle of seasons is explained. His descent brings barrenness. His return brings fertility. This myth is more than story. It is ritual. It was enacted in festivals, remembered in hymns, and tied directly to the sacred marriage. The union of Inanna and Dumuzi, their separation, and their reunion mirror the cycles of planting and harvest, of drought and abundance. The priestess embodying Inanna and the king embodying Dumuzi were not play acting. They were reenacting cosmic truth. Their union was fertility itself. Their embrace the renewal of life. For the temple women who served Inanna, this myth was a backdrop of their lives. To them, the goddess was not distant. She was present, her stories shaping their every action. To wear a necklace in her honor, to sing a hymn in her voice, was to participate in her drama. Their bodies were bound to her myth just as much as their voices were bound to her songs. Archaeology deepens this picture. Excavations at sites such as Uruk, Uar, and Nippur have uncovered temples dedicated to Inanna, filled with offerings of jewelry, carved figurines, and inscribed tablets. In one temple, hundreds of small statues of worshippers were found. Men and women with wide, staring eyes, hands clasped in prayer. These were votive offerings, placed to represent perpetual devotion. To walk into such a temple would have been to walk into a forest of stone figures, all gazing upward in eternal worship. Among these finds are also images of women, sometimes clothed, sometimes bare, associated with fertility. Scholars debate whether these represent the goddess herself, her priestesses, or symbolic figures of abundance. What is clear is that the female form was central to Mesopotamian religion, tied to the cycles of life and death, planting and harvest, marriage and desire. The presence of music also emerges in the archaeological record. Harps and lyres have been uncovered in royal graves, such as the famous instruments of UR. These were not merely for entertainment. Music was essential to ritual, to the hymns sung by temple women, to the chants that invoked the goddess. Inhejuana's hymns, for example, would not have been spoken in silence but performed with rhythm and melody, echoing through the temple halls. The myths of Inanna also reveal the danger of serving her. She was not a goddess of gentle compassion, but a volatile passion. To embody her in ritual was to embody contradiction. One day she was a lover who blessed a land. The next she was a warrior who destroyed cities. Temple women, tied to her cult, lived under the shadow. Their lives, already marked by paradox, mirrored the very nature of the goddess they served. This duality shaped how outsiders perceived them. To serve Inanna was to be associated with love, desire, and fertility, but also with danger, unpredictability, and war. This may explain some of the stigma temple women endured. They were seen as both sacred and suspect, both necessary and unsettling, because the goddess they embodied was herself a paradox. Imagine the atmosphere of a festival in honor of Inanna. The city gathers, drums beat, incense fills the air. The priestess emerges, adorned in shimmering garments. Her presence meant to embody the goddess herself. The people cheer, but beneath the cheers is tinged with fear. For they know that Inanna is not only the bringer of life, but also the taker of it. To honor her is to court both blessing and danger. Through myth and ritual, through archaeology and hymn, we see how deeply the goddess shaped Mesopotamian life. She was not a distant figure in the heavens, but a living force in the city. Her stories explain the cycles of nature. Her rituals legitimized kingship. Her temple women embodied her presence. To serve her was to live inside her paradox, to bear both her glory and her burden. As we move forward in segment 3, we will explore further mysteries, the rituals of everyday worship, the artifacts left behind, and the ways archaeologists and scholars have tried to untangle myth from reality. In the layers of clay, in the fragments of hymns, in the silent figures with staring eyes, we will search for traces of a world where gods and humans were bound together, and where devotion carried both blessing and cost. To truly step inside a Mesopotamian temple, we must look not only at myths and hymns, but at the material traces left behind. Archaeology has given us glimpses of the sacred spaces where worship unfolded, and through them, we can reconstruct the rhythms of ritual that shaped daily life. The temple was not just a building. It was a living organism, the very dwelling of the god or goddess. Mesopotamians believed that their deities did not simply watch in the heavens. They resided physically within their temples. The great statues of Inanna, Nana, or Marduk were not symbolic decorations. They were the gods themselves, imbued with divine presence through elaborate rites of consecration. To step into a temple courtyard was to stand in the shadow of the divine. Archaeologists excavating sites such as Uruk, Ur, and Nippur have uncovered temple foundations, altars, storage rooms, kitchens, and even drains, all of which remind us that divine worship was also practical work. Grain had to be ground, bread baked, beer brewed, animals slaughtered. Temples were economic centers as much as spiritual ones, managing vast estates of farmland, herds, and laborers. In this sense, the women who served there lived at the heart of a bustling institution, one that fed both gods and people. The rituals themselves varied from daily offerings to grand annual festivals. Each day began with the washing and dressing of the divine statue. Priests carefully bathed the image, anointed it with oil, and clothed it in fine garments. Jewelry was placed upon it, incense burned before it, food set upon the altar. The god was treated like a living sovereign, cared for as though flesh and blood. To neglect these rituals was unthinkable, for it risked offending the divine resident. Temple women played a role in these ceremonies. Some prepared offerings, grinding grain, pouring libations, or arranging fruits and breads. Others sang hymns to accompany the rites, their voices rising in rhythm with the priest's actions. Music and words were as essential as food and incense. Together they created a sensory atmosphere that drew the divine presence near. On festival days, the rituals expanded dramatically. In the sacred marriage rites, for example, The high priestess representing Inanna and the king representing Dumuzi performed the symbolic union in a richly decorated chamber. Hymns were sung, prayers recited, incense thick in the air. Outside, the people celebrated with music, feasting, and dancing, believing that the union inside the temple would bless their fields and families. Archaeological finds confirm the scale of these festivals. Large open courtyards, wide enough for processions, have been uncovered. Storage rooms filled with vessels suggest the preparation of massive communal feasts. Clay tablets record the distribution of offerings, the list of animals sacrificed, the names of participants. Even the smallest details, such as jars inscribed with the goddess's name, remind us of how carefully every element was tied to the divine. Other rituals were more mysterious. Some involved divination, where priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals to read omens. Others involved ecstatic performances, where worshippers sang and danced to invoke the goddess's presence. In such ceremonies, the line between sacred and profane blurred, as participants sought to embody divine passion. One intriguing archaeological discovery comes from the Royal Cemetery of UR, where lavish burials reveal the connection between ritual, power, and death. In some graves, lyres and harps were found, suggesting music played a role in funerary rites. In others, entire retinues of attendants were buried with their rulers, perhaps reflecting a belief that service to the divine and royal continued beyond death. These finds remind us that ritual extended into every aspect of life, from daily meals to the final journey into the afterlife. For the sacred women, these rituals were both duty and identity. To sing a hymn was not just performance, it was participation in cosmic order. To prepare offerings was not mere labor, it was feeding the gods who sustained creation. Yet the weight of repetition must have been heavy. Each day demanded precision, each word and gesture bound by tradition. Innovation was rare. Ritual thrived on continuity. For women whose lives are confined to the temple, this repetition became the very structure of existence. It is worth imagining the sensory experience of one such ritual. The temple hall is dim, lit by oil lamps. The scent of incense thickens the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread. The statue of the goddess gleams with inlaid eyes and polished stone. A priest approaches, pouring libations of beer and wine onto the altar. Behind him, temple women sing, their voices weaving to the cavernous space. Drums beat softly, lyres pluck out solemn notes. The air hums with reverence, with the sense that something larger than human life is present. Such ceremonies remind us that Mesopotamian religion was not abstract belief, but lived practice. It engaged all the senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Worshippers did not simply think about the gods. They fed them, clothed them, sang to them, danced for them. Through ritual, the divine and the human were bound together. And yet, for those who served day after day, year after year, the rituals may become a burden as much as a blessing. The sacred women lived their entire lives within this cycle, their bodies and voices dedicated to ceremonies whose meaning stretched far beyond their own experience. They were essential to the rhythm of worship, but their individuality was swallowed by the continuity of ritual. Archaeology captures this paradox. We have their hymns, their temples, their offerings, but rarely their personal words. Apart from figures like in Hejuana, the women themselves are silent in the record. Their lives survive only in fragments. A necklace buried with a priestess, a name scratched on a tablet, a figure carved in clay. The rest has been lost, their individuality erased by time, even as their labor sustained civilizations. As we move forward in segment 3, we will delve into further mysteries, the blurred lines between myth and history, the way outsiders later misunderstood Mesopotamian rituals, and an enduring fascination these practices hold for us today. Through myth, ritual, and artifact, we seek to glimpse not only the gods of Mesopotamia, but the human cost of serving them. When modern people hear the phrase temple prostitution, it stirs images of scandal, of ancient cities where women served gods by serving men, where ritual blurred into commerce. Yet this image owes more to later interpretation than to Mesopotamian reality. To uncover the truth, we must sift carefully through sources, ancient texts, later commentaries, and the biases of historians who wrote long after the rituals had ended. The roots of the misunderstanding lied partly in the ambiguity of Mesopotamian language. Certain words used to describe temple women have been translated in ways that emphasize sexuality. For example, the Sumerian word kadistu and the Akkadian term nadadu have often been rendered as prostitute, but closer study shows they referred more broadly to women dedicated to temple service. Some may have been celibate, others involved in ritual sexuality, still others administrators or singers. To label them all as prostitutes is to flatten a diverse set of roles into a single sensational stereotype. Ancient Greek writers added fuel to the fire. Historians like Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describe Babylonian women compelled to sit in the temple of Ishtar and have intercourse with strangers as part of ritual. His words shaped centuries of belief about Mesopotamian religion, yet scholars now view his account with skepticism. Herodotus often relayed hearsay, mixing fact with rumor. Archaeological evidence does not support the idea of widespread, compulsory sexual rites. More likely, he misunderstood or exaggerated practices he glimpsed from afar. Later commentators in Roman and medieval times built upon these distortions. To them, Babylon was a symbol of decadence, a city of corruption and sin. Linking it with ritualized prostitution fit neatly into their moral narratives. Thus, the idea of sacred prostitution became less a historical fact and more a cultural metaphor, a way of contrasting civilized morality with the supposed excesses of the past. The truth, as so often, is more complex. There is evidence of ritual sexuality in certain contexts, most notably the sacred marriage rite between the king and the priestess of Inanna. Hymns survive that speak an intimate language of the goddess and her lover, enacted through human participants. These rituals were symbolic, tied to fertility and cosmic order, not to commerce. They were exceptional moments, not everyday transactions. Other practices may have involved ritualized intimacy, perhaps as acts of devotion by worshippers or as symbolic offerings. But again, the evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous. A line in a hymn, an image on a seal, a law and a code, none of these proves widespread prostitution as we understand it today. Instead, they point to a variety of practices, some sexual, many not, all framed within the sacred rather than profane. The persistence of the prostitution narrative reveals more about later cultures than about Mesopotamia itself. It reflects a fascination and discomfort people have always felt with sexuality and religion intertwined. To imagine ancient temples filled with erotic rites was to project both allure and condemnation, to see in the past what one feared or desired in the present. For the women who actually lived in these temples, the misinterpretation is a second erasure. Their lives were already constrained, their individuality already sacrificed to ritual, to be remembered only as prostitutes, stripped of dignity and complexity, is to lose them again in history. They were singers, caretakers, administrators, sometimes consorts in sacred rites. They lived paradoxical lives, caught between reverence and stigma. To reduce them to scandal is to ignore the burdens they truly bore. Archaeology supports this correction. Excavations reveal records of women managing temple estates, overseeing workers, and controlling resources. Clay tablets list their names alongside tallies of grain and livestock, showing them as administrators as much as ritual figures. Some took vows of chastity, living in cloistered communities similar in some ways to later monastic orders. Others served as musicians, raising their voices in hymns. Sexuality was only one dimension of the possible roles, and not necessarily the most common. Even the sacred marriage itself may have shifted over time. In some periods, it may have involved physical union between king and priestess. In others, the rite seems to have been enacted symbolically through recitation of hymns, offerings, and staged rituals. The continuity lay not in physical acts, but in the symbolism of union between human ruler and divine goddess. To modern ears, the distinction matters. To ancient Mesopotamians, it may not have, for them, the boundaries between physical and symbolic, between myth and reality, were more porous. To sing of the goddess's embrace was to make it real. To pour libations before her statue was to feed her. To enact a marriage ritual in song and dance was as powerful as any physical act. Their world did not divide the sacred and profane as sharply as ours does. Thus, the enduring myth of sacred prostitution is both true and false. It is true in the sense that sexuality was woven into Mesopotamian ritual, tied to fertility, kingship, and myth. It is false in the sense that it was not widespread prostitution, not the compulsory acts described by later writers. The reality was nuanced, diverse, and deeply embedded in a religious framework that gave meaning to every gesture. Imagine standing in a Mesopotamian temple during fertility festival. The air vibrates with drums, chants, and song. Hymns praise Inanna's love, invoking her union with Dumuzi, a priestess adorned with jewels. Speaks lines of poetry that embody the goddess's passion. The crowd listens, believing that through these words the land itself will be renewed. Sexuality is present, yes, but it is sacred, bound to the rhythm of seasons and the cycles of life. To the worshippers, it is not scandal but necessity. Understanding this truth requires us to shed modern assumptions and listen carefully to the fragments that survive. Only then can we see the temple women of Mesopotamia not as caricatures of scandal, but as complex figures whose service carried both burden and meaning. As we continue in segment 3, we will explore further mysteries, how myths and rituals reflected the anxieties of daily life, how artifacts revealed glimpses of private devotion, and how the line between human and divine was constantly crossed in the lived religion of Mesopotamia. When we think of Mesopotamian religion, it is easy to imagine only the grand festivals. Kings in ceremonial robes, priestesses adorned as goddesses, processions of statues through crowded streets. Yet most of the people who lived in Uruk, Uar, or Babylon did not experience the divine in such dramatic forms. Their religious lives were woven into the small gestures of daily devotion. Prayers whispered at dawn, offerings left in temples, clay figurines placed in household shrines. Archaeology reveals this quieter side of Mesopotamian faith. In excavated houses, small altars have been found, often simple platforms of clay or brick. Upon them, families placed offerings of bread, oil, or incense. Clay figurines of gods and protective spirits, crudely shaped yet deeply meaningful, were kept in corners or niches. These were the gods of the hearth, the guardians of childbirth, the watchers over doorways. They remind us that religion was not confined to the temple. It lived in every household. Personal prayers inscribed on tablets also survive. Some are petitions for health, others for success in business, still others for protection from harm. The language is intimate, filled with phrases of pleading and devotion. A man might ask a goddess to protect his wife in childbirth. A woman might pray for her son's safe return from war. These prayers show us the emotional texture of Mesopotamian religion, less about cosmic drama, more about the fragile hopes of everyday life. Ordinary people also engaged with the temple directly. They brought votive offerings, small statues of themselves carved in stone or molded in clay, placed in temple halls to stand eternally in prayer. Archaeologists have uncovered rooms filled with hundreds of such figures, their wide eyes staring upward in perpetual devotion. Each one represented a person who sought the god's attention long after they had left. In these silent crowds of statues, we glimpse a form of ancient congregation. The role of women in these private devotions was significant. Mothers prayed to their children, wives to their husbands, daughters for their families. Some offered jewelry, weaving tools, or small vessels as gifts to the goddess. In this sense, the devotion of ordinary women paralleled that of temple servants, though on a smaller scale. Both lived lives shaped by Inanna's paradox, turning to her for blessing, yet fearing her wrath. Music, too, played a role in private worship. The same harps and lyres found in royal graves may also have been strummed in households, their notes rising in simple songs of devotion. Children likely grew up hearing hymns sung not only in temples but at home, learning through repetition the names of gods and the stories of myths. Faith was not taught in abstract terms, but lived through sound, gesture, and ritual. The boundary between public and private devotion was porous. A family might participate in a festival by carrying offerings to the temple, joining processions, or watching dramas of myth enacted by priests. In turn, the rituals of the temple echoed in the rhythms of home life. When the high priestess sang as a nana, her words resonated in the prayers of mothers and daughters. When the king enacted Dumuzi's role, his myth of death and return echoed in the cycles of crops that families depended upon. What emerges is a picture religion as all-encompassing. It was not confined to sacred spaces, but saturated the world. The rivers themselves were divine, their floods gifts of the gods. The stars overhead were celestial beings, their movements messages. Even illness was interpreted as divine displeasure, requiring prayer, offerings, and sometimes magical incantations to restore balance. For the temple women, this wider culture reinforced their role. They were not simply servants of a building. They were central figures in society where the gods were everywhere. Their songs echoed not only in ritual halls, but in the imaginations of ordinary people who saw in the presence of the goddess herself. Yet, this also meant the weight of expectation was enormous. If crops failed, if illness spread, if enemies triumphed, the people might question whether the gods had been properly served. In such moments, blame could fall upon the very women whose lives were already constrained. This fragile balance between devotion and disappointment is visible in Mesopotamian laments, poetic texts that mourn the destruction of cities and temples. In these laments, the gods are said to have abandoned their dwellings, leaving people desolate. The voices of women often feature prominently, crying out for mercy, pleading for restoration. Through them, the grief of whole communities was expressed. Their role was not only to sustain the gods in ritual, but to voice the sorrow of the people when divine favor was withdrawn. Imagine an ordinary day in the city of Uar. A woman rises at dawn, lights a small lamp before a clay figurine of a nana, and places a piece of bread as an offering. Her husband goes to the fields, her children to fetch water. Later, she walks to the temple, carrying a small jar of oil to dedicate. She passes a towering ziggurat, its steps reaching toward the sky, and joins a line of worshippers. In the temple courtyard, she hands her offering to a priest, who places it among the gifts. She whispers a prayer for her family's health, bows, and departs. For her, the divine is not distant but woven into each act, each hope, each fear. This is the heart of Mesopotamian devotion, continuity. From the grand ceremonies of kings to the whispered prayers of mothers, from the elaborate rituals of priestesses to crude clay figurines of households, all flow together in a tapestry of belief. The gods were not abstract concepts but living presences, shaping every harvest, every illness, every birth. As we close segment 3, we see how myth, ritual, and devotion intertwined. The grand stories of Inanna and Dumuzi gave meaning to the cycles of nature. The rituals of temple women and kings enacted those stories in living form. The prayers of ordinary people echoed them in miniature, shaping daily life. And archaeology, in uncovering statues, altars, and hymns, allows us to glimpse this ancient world where gods and humans lived side by side. In segment 4, we will turn to contrast, the world of the elite. We will look at how kings, queens, and high officials experience religion not as burden, but as privilege, using it to consolidate wealth and power. While temple women sacrifice freedom, the elite reap prestige. In this comparison, the paradox of Mesopotamian society becomes even clearer. Devotion sustained the gods, but it also sustained inequality. To step out from the dim halls of the temple and into the palaces of Mesopotamia is to step into another world entirely. Here, in the courts of kings and the estates of high priests, the burdens of ritual looked very different. Where temple women sacrifice freedom for duty, the elite enjoy privilege, wealth, and status, often using the very same rituals that confine others to elevate themselves. The The royal palace was not simply a residence. It was a symbol of power, filled with courtyards, storerooms, and administrative chambers. Walls were adorned with painted reliefs or inlaid with precious stones. Servants bustled through the halls, carrying food, water, and gifts. Visitors from distant lands approached with tribute: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedarwood from Lebanon, gold from Anatolia. The king, seated on a high throne, received these offerings as though he were himself a god. For the royal family, religion was not an oppressive burden, but a tool of legitimacy. Kings and queens participated in rituals that bound them to gods, but unlike temple women, these roles enhanced their prestige. When a king enacted the sacred marriage, he was not surrendering himself but affirming his authority. When a queen offered gifts to a goddess, she was not confined but celebrated. The rituals that constrained the lives of sacred women elevated the lives of the elite. Priests, too, enjoyed privilege. High-ranking priests controlled temple wealth, overseeing estates that stretched across fields and pastures. Clay tablets record their management workers, herds, and grain stores. They presided over ceremonies with authority, directing the actions of others. For them, the temple was not a cage but a seat of power. They could lead, negotiate, command. Their voices carried weight in both religion and politics. The contrast becomes clear when we examine the material culture of the elite. In royal tombs, such as those uncovered in the Royal Cemetery of UR, archaeologists have found lavish treasures: golden lyres, inlaid harps, jeweled daggers, silver cups, and elaborately decorated headdresses. One famous find, the Standard of UR, shows scenes of banquets and battles, rulers feasting while servants attend to them. In such images, we see the elite enjoying the abundance of the land, their lives marked by luxury. Compare this with the modest possessions of ordinary temple women: a reed mat, a clay bowl, perhaps a small piece of jewelry. Their lives were bound by simplicity, while the elite lived surrounded by beauty. The same rituals that demanded sacrifice from the many provided feasting for the few. Queens, in particular, held significant roles. Some acted as high priestesses themselves, blending political and religious power. They presided over festivals, distributed offerings, and sometimes even engaged directly in temple administration. Unlike lower-ranking temple women, their service did not erase their status but reinforced it. They were celebrated as living embodiments of the goddess, their presence a mark of prestige for the dynasty. Consider the case of Pompeii, a queen buried in the Royal Cemetery of UR around 2500 BCE. Her tomb contained a wealth of treasures: gold crowns adorned with lapis lazuli, carnelian beads, silver vessels, and finely crafted ornaments. Dozens of attendants were buried alongside her, suggesting they followed her into death as servants. For Pompeii, ritual was not confinement but grandeur, ensuring her glory endured even in the underworld. Her burial contrasts starkly with that of temple women, who left behind little more than anonymity. Feasting was another marker of elite privilege. In royal banquets, music played by lyres and harps accompanied abundant food and drink. Archaeological finds include drinking vessels of gold and silver, evidence of meals rich with roasted meat, fruits, and bread. Wine, imported at great expense, flowed alongside the more common barley beer. These feasts were themselves religious, tied to offerings for gods and ancestors, but they were also celebrations of status. To eat at the king's table was to partake in divine abundance. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens and temple women lived on simpler fare: bread, dates, onions, and beer. Their meals were sustenance, not luxury. Their participation in ritual was service, not celebration. The elite enjoyed religion as spectacle. The common and the bound endured it as duty. The privileges of the elite extended into politics. Kings declared themselves chosen by gods, their victories framed as divine will. Queens reinforced dynastic legitimacy by linking themselves to goddesses. Priests wielded influence through their control of temple resources. In this way, religion reinforced social hierarchy. The gods were served by all, but some were elevated in the serving while others were diminished. Imagine standing in a palace courtyard during a festival. The king, clothed in fine robes, approaches the altar with attendants carrying gifts of gold and silver. The queen follows, adorned with jewels, her presence celebrated as divine embodiment. Musicians play, dancers perform, incense burns. The crowd cheers as rulers and priests enact rituals of abundance. But beyond the palace gates, temple women sing in quieter halls. Their service essential yet uncelebrated. The contrast is stark. One ritual elevates, the other confines. This disparity is not unique to Mesopotamia. It is a pattern repeated across history. Religion, while offering meaning and structure, often divides roles unequally. Those at the top find in it a source of glory. Those at the margins find in it a source of burden. In Mesopotamia, the sacred marriage that legitimized kings was the same ritual that bound priestesses to a life of service. The feasts of the elite were funded by offerings that ordinary people labored to produce. The gods received devotion, but humans experienced it unevenly. As we continue in segment 4, we will explore this contrast further, looking more closely at the daily lives of elites, their wealth, their leisure, their connections to the divine, and comparing them to confined existence of temple servants. Through this contrast, the paradox of Mesopotamian religion becomes sharper. It bound society together, but also reinforced divisions that left some celebrated and others forgotten. If you were to walk to the gates of a Mesopotamian palace, you would immediately sense that this was a different world from the narrow chambers of the temple women. Here, space itself was a declaration of power. Wide courtyards opened into columned halls. Doorways were guarded by colossal statues of lions or bulls. Walls were painted with scenes of conquest and abundance. The air smelled not of incense and ritual smoke, but of roasted meats, perfumes, and imported cedar wood. This was the daily environment of kings and queens, where religion and luxury intertwined. The king's day was structured not only by governance, but by ceremony. In the morning, he might meet scribes and officials who brought clay tablets inscribed with reports from across the realm. Grain harvests, tax collections, temple offerings, disputes between city officials, all were presented for royal judgment. These decisions were framed not as mere administration, but as sacred duty. The king was the shepherd chosen by the gods, and his rulings were believed to reflect divine will. Yet even amid these duties, the king lived surrounded by comfort. He dined on fine bread baked with honey, meat seasoned with herbs, dates and figs from fertile groves, and wine imported from distant lands. His garments were wool dyed in rare colors, trimmed with gold or silver. Jewelry adorned his wrists and neck, not as frivolous ornament, but as symbols of wealth and divine favor. Queens shared in this abundance, and in some cases, their influence extended far beyond the palace walls. They presided over households that included dozens, even hundreds, of attendants, servants, cooks, musicians, and scribes. Some queens acted as priestesses, linking themselves directly to goddesses like Inanna or Ishtar. Others influenced politics through diplomacy, marriage alliances, or temple patronage. In their persons, they embodied the overlap between the divine and the human, much as kings did. Banquets were among the most visible displays of this privilege. Archaeological finds, such as the Standard of UR, depict rulers feasting at low tables while servants pour drinks and musicians play harps. These feasts were not merely indulgence, they were political theater. To dine at the king's table was to acknowledge his abundance, his ability to provide, his connection to the gods who ensured fertility. For guests, every bite and sip carried symbolic meaning. Here was the prosperity of the realm, concentrated in the body of the ruler. Music filled these gatherings, played on lyres, harps, and flutes. Songs might praise the gods, recount victories, or celebrate love. Dancers performed, acrobats entertained, and storytellers recited myths. The sensory richness of these events contrasted sharply with the repetitive chants of temple women. For the elite, ritual was festive, filled with sound and color. For sacred servants, it was duty, marked by confinement. The contrast deepens when we consider mobility. Kings and queens traveled widely, moving between palaces, leading campaigns, visiting temples in distant cities. Their presence was celebrated wherever they went. Citizens lined the streets, bowing as the royal entourage passed. Their movements reinforced their power, their visibility a reminder of divine favor. Temple women, by contrast, were confined. Their lives unfolded within walls they rarely left. Their presence felt only in ritual, their absence unnoticed by the wider city. Even in death, the difference was stark. The royal tombs at UR contained treasures of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, accompanied by attendants buried alongside their rulers. These graves proclaimed eternal wealth and status, ensuring the king or queen entered the afterlife as richly adorned as in life. By contrast, the burials of temple women were modest. Simple clay coffins, a few personal items, sometimes nothing more than a name inscribed on a tablet. Their service in life did not translate into glory in death. This disparity raises a deeper truth. In Mesopotamia, religion was both shared and unequal. All served the gods, but some served in ways that exalted them, while others served in ways that diminished them. The king, in enacting sacred marriage, claimed divinity through union with the goddess. The priestess, though essential to the same ritual, lost her identity in the role. Queens adorned in jewels were celebrated as embodiments of divine femininity. Temple women, stripped of freedom, wore the same title without the same honor. And yet, kings and queens depended upon those very women. Without their voices, the hymns would fall silent. Without their presence, the rituals would collapse. The abundance of the palace rested on the devotion of the temple. The contrast was not separation but interdependence. One life of privilege sustained by another sacrifice. Imagine for a moment two parallel scenes. In the palace, the king reclines at a feast, drinking from a golden cup, music surrounding him, laughter filling the hall. In the temple, at the same hour, sacred women chant hymns in dim light, their voices echoing against stone. Both serve the gods. Both are part of the same society. Yet one serves with joy and abundance, the other with confinement and duty. This was the paradox of Mesopotamian life. The divine bound all together, but never equally. Queens, in particular, highlight this paradox. Some held true influence, shaping policy and ritual alike. They could commission temples, sponsor festivals, and be remembered in inscriptions. Their names survived because their roles were celebrated. Temple women, by contrast, remained mostly anonymous, their individuality erased. They were essential yet forgotten, visible only when serving, invisible otherwise. As we continue through segment 4, we will explore further dimensions of elite life. The role of priests and administrators in controlling temple wealth, the political uses of ritual, and the enduring inequality between those who ruled in luxury and those who served in silence. Through this contrast, the deeper truth of Mesopotamian society emerges. Its religion was universal, but its burdens and blessings were distributed unequally. While kings and queens embodied the visible splendor of Mesopotamian society, priests and temple administrators formed its backbone. They were the keepers of ritual precision, the managers of vast temple estates, and the interpreters of divine will. Their role was both spiritual and economic, and through it they wielded immense authority. Authority that elevated them far above the temple women whose lives they oversaw. Temples were not merely houses of worship. They were among the largest institutions of the ancient world. They owned fields of grain, orchards of date palms, herds of sheep and cattle. They employed scribes to record transactions, overseers to manage labors, cooks to prepare offerings, and guards to protect storerooms. In this sense, a temple was part sanctuary, part palace, part warehouse. To serve the gods meant also to manage wealth on a staggering scale. Priests sat at the center of the system. At the top were the Sangu, high-ranking officials who directed offerings and ceremonies. Below them were priests of various specialties, diviners who read omens and stars or in the livers of sacrificial animals, chanters who recited incantations, exorcists who fought demons with ritual words. Each role carried prestige, and each reinforced the authority of the temple. But prestige was matched by material gain. Priests had access to temple resources. They dined on the food of offerings, wore fine garments, and lived in houses near the temple precincts. Unlike temple women, who consumed food as part of communal rations, priests enjoyed choice and abundance. Clay tablets record the distribution of grain, oil, and beer, with priests often receiving larger shares. For them, devotion to the gods translated into privilege on earth. Temple administrators, often drawn from scribal families, played equally crucial roles. They kept the records, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that survive today. These tablets record everything from the number of sheep sacrificed on a festival day to the quantity of beer allotted to workers. Through writing, the administrators maintained control, ensuring that wealth flowed steadily into the temple's coffers. This control extended into the lives of ordinary people. Farmers paid a portion of their harvest to the temple. Shepherds gave part of their flocks. Merchants made offerings of goods. In return, the temple distributed rations, provided employment, and maintained social order. Yet the balance of power was unequal. The temple collected far more than it returned, accumulating wealth that reinforces authority. For the priests themselves, rituals were moments of both duty and display. In the daily care of the divine statue, they approached with solemn precision, bathing and dressing the image as though attending to a living sovereign. They alone had the authority to draw near, to whisper prayers, to anoint with oil. Temple women assisted, but the final authority rested with the male priestly hierarchy. Their proximity to the divine translated into social power, power that extended into politics, for kings needed their blessing. This dependence gave priests influence over royal policy. A king who lost priestly support risked losing legitimacy. Conversely, priests who aligned themselves with a ruler could shape his reign. In some cases, tensions flared. Kings attempted to assert dominance over temples, while priests defended their autonomy. Yet the interdependence remained. Neither could rule without the other. The economic power of temples also shaped society. Temples lent grain to farmers, sometimes at high rates of interest. They controlled workshops where wool was spun and cloth woven, employing scores of workers. They owned ships that sailed the rivers, trading goods across regions. In this way, temples were economic engines, their wealth fueling the prosperity of cities. Priests and administrators managed this wealth, becoming some of the most powerful figures in Mesopotamian life. Imagine walking through a temple storeroom. Clay jars filled with barley-lined walls. Sheep and goats bleed in pens. Scribes sit at low tables, pressing reed styluses into damp clay, recording the movement of goods. Overseers call out instructions. Workers haul baskets of grain. Guards stand watch at the doors. This was not a quiet sanctuary, but a hive of activity, as much a place of commerce as of prayer. For the priests, this environment was one of control. They directed, commanded, recorded. For temple women, it was one of service. They sang the hymns, poured the libations, swept the floors, lived within the walls. The difference was profound. Priests turned ritual into power, while women turned ritual into sacrifice. The disparity is visible in how history remembers them. Priests' names preserved in inscriptions, their titles carved on monuments, their deeds recorded in chronicles. Temple women remained largely anonymous, their contributions absorbed into the collective. Even when both stood before the same altar, chanting the same hymns, one was remembered, the other forgotten. This imbalance reflects the larger truth of Mesopotamian society. Religion unified, but it also stratified. The gods were worshipped by all, yet their service deepened divisions. Kings gained legitimacy, queens gained prestige, priests gained wealth, while sacred women bore the weight of confinement. The temple was both a house of the gods and a mirror of inequality, and yet it worked. For centuries, this system sustained some of the earliest cities on Earth. Temples provided structure, priests provided continuity, kings provided leadership. The price was borne unevenly, but the result was enduring civilization. Picture, at last, a grand festival. The king and queen process through the city, priests chant hymns, temple women sing in haunting unison. The crowd watches, awed by the spectacle. In that moment, the gods seem present, the city united. Yet beneath the harmony lies hierarchy. The wealth of the temple fills the hands of priests. The glory of the ritual crowns the king, while the women who make it possible slip back into the shadows of anonymity. As we move into the final part of segment 4, we will examine this contrast in sharper relief, exploring how religion reinforced inequality and how the cost of devotion fell most heavily on those with the least freedom. By setting the lives of elites against those of temple women, we see most clearly the paradox at the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. Devotion sustained society, but sacrifice was never shared equally. As we come to the end of our journey through Mesopotamia as a sacred world, the contrast between those who ruled and those who served grows sharpest. On one side stood the elites, kings, queens, and priests, who transformed religion into legitimacy, wealth, and splendor. On the other side stood the temple women, whose lives were circumscribed by duty, their individuality dissolved into ritual, their sacrifices largely invisible. Both groups served the gods, but in profoundly unequal ways. For the king, ritual was elevation. His union with the goddess through the sacred marriage transformed him from mere ruler into cosmic spouse, chosen to ensure fertility of land and people. For the high priestess, the same ritual meant surrender, her body symbolizing the goddess, her life shaped by a role she did not choose. One act, two very different consequences. Glory for the man, confinement for the woman. Queens, too, found power and devotion. They were adorned as embodiments of divine femininity, celebrated in inscriptions, and remembered in lavish burials. Their jewels, crowns, and headdresses, uncovered by archaeologists, still gleam after 4 millennia, testifying to their honored place. Temple women, by contrast, left behind little more than clay bowls and faint traces of names on tablets. The material record tells a story of privilege versus anonymity, luxury versus restraint. Priests and administrators turned ritual into authority. They managed estates, recorded transactions, controlled offerings. Their wealth and influence grew with each festival, each sacrifice, each prayer spoken on behalf of the people. Temple women, in contrast, remained locked into the rhythm of chants and hymns, their contribution essential but unrewarded. Without their voices, the rituals would falter, yet their names rarely entered history. This inequality was not accidental. It was structural, embedded in the very design of Mesopotamian religion. The gods were served by all, but the benefits were not shared equally. Religion provided meaning and order, but it also justified hierarchy. Kings were shepherds chosen by the gods. Priests were interpreters of divine will. Queens were partners in divine legitimacy. Temple women were servants, their sacrifice accepted as necessary, but not celebrated as glorious. And yet, their lives mattered. Without them, the system would have collapsed. Without their hymns, the festivals would have been silent. Without their presence, the sacred marriage would have been incomplete. Without their service, the gods' needs would have gone unmet. The splendor of kings, the wealth of priests, the legitimacy of queens, all rested on the unseen labor of women, whose freedom was surrendered to ritual. If we imagine one final scene, the contrast becomes clear. In the palace, the king reclines at a banquet. Musicians play, servants pour wine. Courtiers praise his wisdom. His garments shine with gold thread. His words echo with authority. He is celebrated as chosen of the gods, his rule sanctified by ritual. In the temple, a woman kneels before a statue of Inanna. She sings a hymn she has sung countless times before, her voice steady, her face illuminated by flickering oil lamps. No crowd cheers her. No inscription records her name. Her devotion is silent, her sacrifice invisible. Yet in her chant lies the continuity of civilization. These two lives, so different, were bound together. The king's legitimacy required her service. The gods' favor depended on her devotion. The palace banquet and the temple hymn were two sides of the same coin. One glittered in memory, the other faded into silence. Together, they sustained Mesopotamia. The paradox is profound. Religion unified the people, but it also stratified them. It gave meaning, but it also demanded sacrifice. It elevated a few to glory while consigning many to anonymity. And yet, within that paradox, society endured for centuries. The rivers flowed, the crops grew, the cities thrived, because devotion, whether celebrated or forgotten, bound the people to their gods and to each other. As we leave the ziggurats and temples behind, we are left with questions as old as civilization. Who bears the weight of devotion? Who reaps its rewards? What does it mean to live a life given to the sacred, when the sacred does not give equally in return? Now, let us return to quiet. Imagine the streets of UR at dusk, the sun sinking beyond the horizon, the ziggurat casting its long shadow across the city. In the palace, lamps are lit for feasting. In the temple, hymns fade into silence. Families gather in courtyards, sharing bread and beer. Children sleep beneath reed mats, dreaming of the stories told in myth. The goddess Inanna, fierce and radiant, remains ever present. Her myths echo in the minds of kings and commoners alike. Her rituals bind society together, even as they divide its burdens. Her paradox, love and war, fertility and destruction, shapes the lives of those who serve her. For the temple women, her service meant confinement. For the king, it meant legitimacy. For the queen, it meant prestige. For the priest, it meant authority. For the ordinary citizen, it meant hope. And for us, thousands of years later, it means remembrance, a glimpse into a world both strange and familiar, where devotion shaped every breath of life. Why did it suck to be a temple prostitute in Mesopotamia? Because their service demanded everything and returned little. Because their sacrifice was essential yet invisible. Because they carried the weight of the goddess without the rewards of power. And yet, without them, Mesopotamia could not have thrived. They were the voices in the shadows, the unseen pillars of civilization. Their story, though faint, still whispers through the clay tablets and temple ruins, reminding us that history is not only the tale of kings and queens, but also those whose devotion sustained them.